For those of you guys who don't follow my channel and maybe are not aware, the 67 Nova that I'm building behind me is my very first ever car build. And I've done something kind of crazy that nobody else, I think, in history ever does with their very first car build, which is to say, I built my own entire chassis for this car completely from scratch. And to say that I have learned a lot in the process, it would be a remarkable understatement. If you'll give me a few minutes of your time, I wanted to just do a little video and kind of share all of the things that I've learned in building my own chassis from scratch for the first time. Technically, I should probably correct that statement. I am running a Detroit Speed independent front suspension system that goes from here forward that's from Detroit Speed. You know, I told myself in the beginning of this thing that maybe I would box the frame rails, do some subframe connectors, maybe a little Detroit Speed, mini tub kit, something like that. But as I dug into this car, I found that it had taken a substantial hit in the rear, and as a result, the frame rails had been repaired. They had been repaired and welded back together in a very poor quality fashion. In fact, they had even used Bondo, as you can see in some of these pictures, to make the frame rail look like it was in good shape. So once I realized that I just had garbage stock frame rails and that the original geometry was probably shot to hell 30 years ago, I decided it was frame time. In all honesty, not just that, I did have a local hot rod builder a few years ago who owns a local reputable shop that told me, quite frankly, that he just didn't have confidence that I could build a chassis for this car, and that if I got the thing off by 1/4 of an inch, it was going to go down the road kind of slanted like that. And so as a screw you to him, it kind of made me think, you know what, maybe I do want to go ahead and build this chassis, kind of in the hopes that maybe, just maybe one day, I could be driving the Nova down the road in a straight line, see him, give him the bird as I went by. God, I hope it happens. Quick disclaimer, I am not a professional builder, so if you take advice from me in this video, take it with a grain of salt. Now, with that said, a lot of what I'm going to share with you in this video is stuff that I have learned myself after speaking with a lot of other professional builders. So a lot of what I'm trying to share with you here today is coming from pro builders and kind of being filtered through Ian, the amateur builder. The very first thing that I want you to know is if you're going to make your own chassis like I've done, you've got to have something to build the chassis off of. You can't just start the thing in 3D space with nothing to hold it everywhere. That is a JD squared Dr. Jig. I got that thing locally, and basically what it does is it allows me to start setting up the chassis on top of something else that is completely rigid and completely flat in one plane. If you're wanting to build a chassis where you know everything is straight, everything is flat, it is square, you are going to have to spend the money and get yourself a frame jig. So the way that I decided to get my car mounted to this jig was I built a set of rails that you see right here that I welded to the jig, and I was very, very careful in putting those rails onto this jig, making sure that they were absolutely parallel, perfectly square, everything you can think of. A lot of care went into welding those rails into place, and I did that so that you can see in these pictures, I ultimately dropped the car right down onto these rails to where the rockers sat on those rails, and at that point, I knew that my car was perfectly level side to side. It was perfectly square to the jig in every single way, and that's how I set my car on those rails and attached it to the jig. The big decision that you have to make in doing this, once you've decided you're going to build your own chassis, is, okay, is the chassis and the body, are they going to bolt together or are they going to weld together? At the end of the day, I wanted the car to be absolutely 100% solid in every way. No squeaking, no nothing. I wanted everything to be just as solid as humanly possible. So I decided to make the body of my car and the chassis weld together. The way that I did that is, if you have a look here, you'll notice here's my 2-inch by 3-inch frame rail running alongside my rocker. Here's my pinch weld right here. You'll notice I have a piece of 1/2-inch angle iron that runs from one end all the way to the other, and you can see welds attaching there to the rocker and there to the actual 2-inch by 3-inch piece of tubing. So that's how I decided to do it. And at the end of the day, I made the entire body of the car weld to the chassis. I know some folks are going to ask me and say, well, Ian, why not just weld your frame rail right to, the inside of your rocker right there? And the answer to that question is because the manufacturing processes of these cars from the 60s, frankly, is just garbage. When I first put that frame rail in the car, you had all gaps, all kinds of big gaps going down through here because the inside of that rocker right there, it wasn't straight worth a damn. And so at the end of the day, I ended up deciding to do this 1/2-inch angle iron that you see here, really to kind of serve almost as like shoe mold does in a house, where it protects, or covers up these holes along the bottom of the baseboard where the baseboard and the floor don't meet. So you run the shoe mold to take up the gap. Exact same kind of deal here. You're just covering up those gaps with that 1/2-inch angle iron. So this is kind of crazy. The way that I actually designed the chassis in this car, I don't have any kind of, fancy scanning software to scan the car and then fancy software to draw up the chassis for it. The way I designed the chassis in this car was I actually did it with Photoshop. I took a photo of the inside of the car when it was just a great big open space blank canvas, and then started drawing lines on pictures in Photoshop to get an idea for what I wanted to create. Use one color line for, exhaust, and then a different color line for the chassis frame rails. I literally designed the chassis of this car in Photoshop. So let's suppose you've already got the body of your car and you've already got your frame jig. If you only hear me say one thing about this entire process, let it be this, okay? The top of the frame jig ultimately needs to be used as the actual ground that the car will sit on. So what you're going to do is you're going to get whatever tires it is that you want to run on this thing. You're going to set the tires on the top of the frame jig and then use your lift to lower the car down onto the tires. You've got to understand, you cannot build your chassis and incorporate it into the car until you know vertically where the chassis is supposed to go in reference to the body. And so if you don't know the ride height of the car, then you don't know where to build the chassis. So you put your tires there, you lower the car down, you get the ride height where you want it and say, okay, that's the ride height that I want. And at that point, you affix the body of the car to the frame jig with the ride height that you want, and then you can proceed to build your chassis. One thing that I should share with you is understand that these older cars are really bad about not being square. I was warned about that from a professional builder from day one. And so what I did was I took a measurement from the back corner of the car, the left rear, to somewhere here over up in the right front, and then did the same thing left front going over to the right rear. And I basically took kind of an X-shaped measurement, if you will, trying to see if the car was square. It was about 3/8 of an inch out of square. And so believe it or not, I put a couple of tack welds of my rocker up to those rails we just looked at on the frame jig. And then I had to put some wood blocks up against the front of the car on the opposite side and start hammering on it with a damn sledgehammer in order to push one side of the car back about 3/8 of an inch, because the car, the actual, the body of the car was not square from the factory. So I had to fix Chevrolet, maybe it was Chevrolet, maybe it wasn't, maybe the thing was in a huge crash at some point, who knows? But the point is, the car was not square. It's very common that these old cars are not square, and you damn sure don't want to start building your chassis until you're sure it's square. If you're going to build your own chassis, one of the things that I would want to draw a lot of attention to is the seat mounts in the car. If we have a look at my seat mounts right here, there's my rear seat mount, there's my front seat mount right there. You can see these portions right here come off of the stock Camaro seat and stick down below the frame rail right there. So you need to make the determination of, are your seats going to sit on top of your frame rails, or are they going to go between the frame rails? This is important because if you put them on top of the frame rails, you better make sure that you've got enough space, enough head space in there. If you have a look at this picture here, you can see that I was testing, the ride height, if you will, the amount of space that I had going up to the roof of the car. Did that long ago as I was making these determinations. If you're going to make your seat sit down between the frame rails, all of a sudden now you've got to decide, okay, well, is that going to eat up important space for something like a cooler or exhaust or whatnot? You've got to make that determination first. Is your seat going to sit on top of or in between the frame rails? Not just that, I would also tell you, to expect that you really need to plan carefully about how you're going to mount the seats of your car to your frame rails. That's going to kind of determine the spacing of the frame rails as well. We got a frame rail right there, and then we got another frame rail right here. If we were to have a look over here on this side of the car, you'll see that I've got these brackets that hold the seat to the frame. However, if we were to come over here and have a look, you don't see any brackets at all. There's no brackets there because there's actually a threaded bung welded to the top side of that frame rail where a bolt goes through the seat into the frame rail. You've got to think about these things in advance, because if you just go putting frame rails in the car, you may decide that your seat is possibly too high, or all of a sudden you're having to mount it off center from the steering wheel, which is no good. It's quite a lot of trouble to get the ergonomics of it all correct, to be completely honest with you. If I come over here to my little scrap pile in my shop, got a little scrap pile over here. There's a seat mount. There's a seat mount. There's probably a half a dozen different sets of seat mounts in my scrap pile where I realized, damn, it's not lined up with the steering wheel. The seat's too far forward, doesn't have enough adjustability. You have to think about all of this stuff very, very carefully from day one, or you're going to end up with ergonomics that suck. Next, I want to talk for just a minute here about the drive shaft. If you're running, say, a 700 horsepower LS like I am with an aluminum drive shaft, obviously that's a big safety risk if that thing comes up into the car. So when I built the chassis of my car, I engineered into the design from day one how I was going to keep that drive shaft into the car. I've got 3 different ways that I do this. First, if you have a look back here, you'll notice that I have basically built all of the chassis that holds the independent rear suspension system so that it's kind of encased. This is a drive shaft loop right back here in the back of the car, so the back of the drive shaft really couldn't come out of the car if it wanted to. I also put in a cross member right here that connects my 2 frame rails, so you know, if anything were to break at either end, it just flops down and then just rides right inside that. Not just that, I also got myself some 1/4 inch thick strip that's about 2.5 inches wide. You see it right there, and it goes all the way from one side to the other. And basically, I just followed that right along the inside of the drive shaft tunnel right there. So I've got this 1/4 inch thick, you know, retainer, if you will, that keeps the drive shaft in the car in the event that, you know, anything terrible happened. Now, I do want to tell you, if you're doing this, carefully make sure that you engineer into this how you're going to get that drive shaft out of the car. I have to take my exhaust out of the car in order to get the drive shaft out, and there's just enough room to be able to bring that drive shaft down and pull it out through here. If there was a 1/4 inch less space, the drive shaft would be permanently in the car, and I'd have to take either the differential or the motor out of the car to get the drive shaft out. So it's really tight. If you're ever going to do this, just make sure from day one, when you get things tacked into place, don't forget to make sure that you can get your drive shaft out the car. One of the next big decisions that you've got to make if you're going to build a chassis, as I have, is you've got to decide, is your exhaust going to go under the frame or through the frame? This is one of the reasons that I decided to make my chassis out of 2 inch by 3 inch rectangular tubing. It's 1/8 inch thick. A lot of your pro builders out there are doing 4 inch chassis, and I'm really just convinced that that's absolutely overkill to do a 4 inch chassis. I did the math on it, and I came to the realization that if I bumped it from a 4 inch tall frame rail down to a 3 inch tall frame rail, that I could run my exhaust under the frame instead of trying to go through the frame. Everything all of a sudden would be significantly less complicated, and I would still have enough ground clearance where I wouldn't have to worry about my exhaust hanging on, you know, a speed bump or something like that. So that's a big decision you have to make. Is your exhaust going to go under or through the frame? I decided to make mine go under and just make it a lot less complicated. The last thing I want to say about planning your chassis is consider what's going to run through your frame rails. If you have a look here at the back of the car, you'll notice that my fuel lines right there, they go inside the chassis. They come through this little triangular section right here and then just start following right along inside my frame rails. If we go to the other end of the car, all of a sudden we can see right here where those fuel lines come out of the frame rails there. You can see real well right there, and then go to the motor. So that was kind of one of those cases where I got it right. But frankly, in other places, I didn't. And I'll give you a good example of that. So you can see right here there's my brake line and some electrical lines that are running right along beside that frame rail. If I had really thought about this better in advance, have a look right here at the frame rails, okay? So I probably would have cut an area out inside of the chassis right there so that this was actually open, so that I could run something, you know, through there and then have it all of a sudden come right down through here. But I can't do that because I didn't plan on that. I left that right there closed off on the inside. That's the kind of thing that I would tell you to think about in advance. If you'll plan where things are going to go in advance, all of a sudden you can build a chassis that's prettier and cleaner and more professional and all of those things. So just consider, where are you going to run things like brake lines, fuel lines, there's a battery line. Where are you going to run all of that stuff? If you'll plan in advance and put it inside your frame rails, you'll end up with a better product. I'd like to take this opportunity to tell you that there is absolutely nothing more important in building a chassis than the ergonomics of it. If it's not comfortable, you're not going to want to drive it, and how much money and time you put into it doesn't mean crap if you don't want to drive it. If you'll have a look at a few of these shots, you'll notice that I was using my shoe in the car to actually figure out, you know, the depth of things, how much space was needed, you know, for a shoe to fit comfortably, things of that nature, as I'm sitting there, you know, building the floor pans and things of that nature. That same kind of attention to detail is incredibly important in the chassis. You know, when you're setting up your seats, do I have enough adjustability forward and rearward? Is my seat too high or too low to where, you know, I'm barely seeing over the steering wheel, or I'm hitting my head up against, you know, the headliner? Is the shifter too far away? Are my pedals so far close to the floor that it's not comfortable? Or are the pedals so high that I'm pushing on them with the edge of my toes? You've got to consider all of these things when you're building your chassis, and make sure that you set everything up so it's ergonomically comfortable. If you don't do that, all is lost. One last tip that I want to give you about building your own chassis is weld-through primer. If you're going to do what I did and you're going to mate the body of your car to your chassis, you're going to have all of these areas where two pieces of metal are going to touch each other, they're going to weld together, and then it's never going to see the daylight ever again. So take, for instance, this example here. This is my 2" by 3" chassis rail, and you'll notice that the epoxy primer right here extends up underneath in between that seam. The same can be said along the inside of the rocker right here. All of that stuff was either primed with epoxy primer or weld-through primer before I welded it into place, to be sure that once I finally finished the underside of the car, rust didn't start to propagate out between all of the seams and destroy the finish on the underside of the car. So that's basically my last big tip here. You're going to join two pieces of metal together. Make sure to prime those things on the inside so that rust doesn't just take over from day one. The very last thing that I want to say about building your own custom chassis, as I have done, is be ready to screw up and waste your time. You're going to build things into the car and realize that it's not going to work quite like you hoped, and then you're going to end up throwing it in the scrap bin, just like I showed you earlier. Just understand that this is part of the process. It's going to happen. You can't let it get you down. Sometimes you're going to build stuff, it's not going to work, you're going to have to build it again. That's where that saying comes from. It's that nice because we build it twice. Here in the very near future, I got a video coming out that I'm excited to do. I'm going to put some GoPros underneath my car, and I'm going to go out and slalom the car and show you the Heights independent rear suspension system and the Detroit Speed independent front suspension system working on the car, and just kind of do a little review of what I think of those systems and show them in action. I think today, you know, this IRS and this IFS in this car together are well over 20,000 bucks. So I got some really awesome suspension on this car. I'm excited to show you that in an upcoming video. So there you go. Like, subscribe, follow along, all of that good stuff if you want to make sure that you don't miss any of my future videos. I hope you guys would follow along. I appreciate you guys watching. Hope you learned something. If you got something you want to add below to the comments, by all means, please do. I commonly answer the comments. I appreciate you taking the time to watch. Y'all have a good one.